grandchildren asked him. "Grandpa, did you really fly planes before?" John Matthews smiled. "I retired 15 years ago, kids. Those days are behind me." But 3 hours later, on that same flight, when the pilot had a heart attack, those grandchildren would see what their grandfather was truly capable of. Where are you watching this video from? Do you have retired soldiers or pilots in your family? Share with us, because today I'm going to show you that sometimes we don't really know who our loved ones truly are. This is the story of Captain John Matthews, a man who thought his flying days were over, but on February 23, 2024, at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, he learned that some skills never truly retire. They just wait for the moment when they're needed most. John Matthews was 67 years old and had been enjoying retirement for the past 15 years. After 30 years of flying F-16 fighter jets for the United States Air Force, completing over 200 combat missions, and earning 3 distinguished flying crosses, he had earned his peaceful life in a quiet suburb of Virginia. His days now consisted of tending his garden, playing chess at the local senior center, and most importantly, spending time with his 2 grandchildren, Emma, age 8, and Lucas, age 10. John's wife Sarah often joked that he had traded his fighter jet for a lawnmower, and John would laugh and say that was exactly the trade he wanted. But what Sarah and the grandchildren didn't fully understand was that flying wasn't just John's job, it was coded into his DNA. Every time a plane flew overhead, John would look up instinctively, calculating speed, altitude, and trajectory, without even thinking about it. His hands would sometimes move as if operating invisible controls. The pilot never truly leaves the cockpit, even when his body is standing in a garden. The family had planned this trip for months. Sarah wanted to show Emma and Lucas where she had grown up in London. It would be their first transatlantic flight, and the children were buzzing with excitement for days before departure. "Grandpa, will you be scared on the plane?" Emma had asked while they were packing. John had smiled and ruffled her hair. "Sweetheart, I've flown more hours in the air than most people driving cars. The sky is like a second home to me." What John didn't say, what he couldn't explain to an 8-year-old, was that civilian passenger planes made him slightly uncomfortable. In a fighter jet, you were in complete control, making split-second decisions at supersonic speeds. In a passenger plane, you were just cargo, trusting someone else with your life. For a man who had spent 3 decades being the one everyone trusted, it was a strange feeling. Flight 227 from New York JFK to London Heathrow was scheduled to depart at 7:45 p.m. on February 23, 2024. It was a Boeing 777-300ER, capable of carrying 396 passengers, though this particular flight had 237 souls aboard, including the crew. The Matthews family had seats in row 34, John and Sarah in B and C, with Emma and Lucas across the aisle in D and E. It was towards the back of the plane, but John preferred it that way. Statistically safer, he had told Sarah, though he knew the statistics were complicated. Captain Michael Torres, age 48, was the pilot in command that evening. He had 15,000 flight hours and an impeccable safety record. His co-pilot, First Officer James Chen, age 32, was relatively new but well-trained and eager. Neither of them knew that their passenger in seat 34B had more combat flying experience than both of them combined. The first 3 hours of the flight were completely routine. The Boeing 777 climbed to its cruising altitude of 37,000 feet. The seatbelt signs went off, and the cabin crew began their service. Emma and Lucas were glued to their seatback entertainment screens, watching animated movies. Sarah was reading a book. John was doing what he always did on planes, watching, observing, listening to the subtle sounds of the aircraft. About 90 minutes into the flight, somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, John noticed something that most passengers wouldn't have registered. The engine sound changed, just slightly. Not a problem, just a minor adjustment in throttle, but it triggered something in John's trained ear. He leaned over to Sarah. "Did you hear that?" "Hear what?" Sarah asked, looking up from her book. "Nothing. Never mind." John settled back in his seat, telling himself to relax. He wasn't the pilot. He was just a passenger. He needed to let go of the instincts that had kept him alive for 30 years in combat zones. But 20 minutes later, John's instincts proved they weren't something he could simply turn off. The intercom crackled to life, but instead of the usual calm voice of a flight attendant, there was tension in the speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there is a doctor on board, please press your call button immediately." Several call buttons lit up around the cabin. John watched as 2 passengers, both apparently medical professionals, were quickly escorted toward the front of the plane by flight attendants who were trying to maintain calm but clearly concerned expressions. Sarah grabbed John's hand. "What do you think happened?" "Could be anything," John said. but his military-trained mind was already running through scenarios: medical emergency, probably a passenger, heart attack, stroke, severe allergic reaction. The plane would divert if necessary. Standard procedure. Emma looked worried. "Grandpa, is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart. Someone probably just doesn't feel well. The doctors will help them." But John noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The flight attendants weren't just concerned. They were scared, and they kept looking toward the cockpit door, not the passenger cabin. 10 minutes passed. Then another announcement, and this time the flight attendant's voice was barely controlled panic. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is an emergency announcement. If anyone on board has any flying experience, any experience at all with aircraft, please press your call button immediately. This is urgent." The cabin erupted in confused murmurs. Sarah's grip on John's hand tightened painfully. Lucas stopped watching his movie and looked at his grandfather with wide eyes. John felt his heart rate increase, but it wasn't panic. It was the same heightened alertness he had felt before every combat mission. His body was preparing for action before his mind had fully processed what was happening. A flight attendant, a young woman named Jennifer, whose name tag John had noticed earlier, came rushing down the aisle, desperately scanning the passengers. When she reached row 34, John raised his hand. "I have flying experience," he said calmly. Jennifer almost collapsed with relief. "Thank God. Please come with me immediately, sir. We need you right now." As John stood up, Sarah grabbed his arm. "John, what's happening?" "I don't know yet. Stay with the kids. Everything will be fine." Lucas called out, "Grandpa, are you going to fly the plane?" John turned back and gave his grandson what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "I'm just going to see if I can help, buddy. Watch your sister for me." As John followed Jennifer toward the front of the plane, he noticed that several other passengers were staring at him, some with hope, others with fear. An elderly woman clutched her rosary beads. A businessman had gone completely pale. Everyone sensed that whatever was happening was serious. When they reached the cockpit door, Jennifer's voice dropped to a whisper. "Sir, I need to know, what kind of flying experience do you have?" "Fighter jets, F-16s, 30 years, US Air Force, retired 15 years ago." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears of relief and terror. Simultaneously, "The captain had a heart attack about 15 minutes ago. The doctors are working on him, but he's not responding. The first officer ate the same meal as the captain and he's unconscious too. They think it's severe food poisoning. The plane is on autopilot, but we need to land it," and her voice broke. "Nobody knows how." John felt the familiar sensation of adrenaline sharpening his senses, slowing down time. This was the feeling he knew from combat, when everything became crystal clear, and all that mattered was the mission. But there was one critical difference. In combat, he only had his own life to protect. Now he had 237 souls depending on him, including his wife and grandchildren. "Take me to the cockpit," John said. When the cockpit door opened, John saw organized chaos. Captain Torres was on the floor. 2 passengers, both doctors, performing CPR. First Officer Chen was slumped in his seat, conscious but vomiting into a bag, clearly in no condition to fly. And there, through the windscreen, was the view John hadn't seen from a pilot's perspective in 15 years. Nothing but dark ocean and darker sky, the instrument panels glowing with more information than any normal person could process. But John wasn't a normal person. He was a fighter pilot, and fighter pilots don't panic. One of the doctors looked up at John with desperate hope. "Are you a pilot?" "Yes." "What's his condition?" "Massive cardiac arrest. We've been doing CPR for 12 minutes. He's not responding. I'm sorry, but I don't think he's going to make it." John nodded, processing this information without emotion. There would be time for emotion later. Right now there was only the mission. He moved to the captain's chair and sat down. His hands moved to the controls, and it was like meeting an old friend who had changed completely. The yoke felt different from an F-16 stick. The throttle controls were in the wrong place. The instrument panel was overwhelming with information he didn't need and missing information he did need. The flight attendant, Jennifer, stood behind him, her voice shaking. "Sir, can you land this plane?" John looked at the instruments, calculating. They were 1,800 miles from New York, 1,600 miles from London, cruising at 37,000 feet with approximately 4 hours of fuel remaining. The Boeing 777 weighed roughly 180 tons. In an F-16, John had landed at speeds of 150 knots with precision targeting systems. This plane would land at 130 knots with completely different handling characteristics, and he had exactly 0 training on it. "I don't know," John said honestly, "but I'm going to try. Get me in contact with air traffic control." The radio crackled to life. "Flight 227, this is Shanwick Oceanic Control. We've been monitoring your emergency. What is your status?" John keyed the mic, his voice steady despite the impossible situation. "Shanwick, this is Flight 227. I'm a passenger, former Air Force pilot. The captain is down, first officer is incapacitated. I have control of the aircraft, but I've never flown this type before. I'm going to need significant help." There was a pause that lasted just 2 seconds but felt like an eternity. Then, "Flight 227, understand you're a military pilot taking control. Stand by, we're connecting you with a 777 captain who will talk you through everything." Within minutes, John was connected to Captain Robert Hayes, a 20-year Boeing 777 veteran who was at home in London when he received the emergency call from air traffic control. "John, I'm Bob. I'm going to get you through this. First things first, is the autopilot engaged?" "Yes, showing engaged on the flight management system." "Good, that buys us time. The autopilot will keep the plane level and on course, but eventually, you're going to have to take manual control and land this aircraft. Before we get there, I need to know, what's your experience level?" 30 years, F-16 fighter jets, over 3,000 flight hours, 200 combat missions. "But Bob, I need to be straight with you. I haven't flown anything in 15 years, and I've never touched a civilian aircraft." "Understood. Here's what you need to know. Fighter jets and passenger planes are completely different animals. Your F-16 responds instantly to input. This plane is like steering an ocean liner. Everything happens slower, heavier. But here's the good news, you have the most important thing any pilot needs. You know how to stay calm when things go wrong." For the next hour, Bob walked John through every system on the Boeing 777. The flight management computer, the auto throttle, the landing gear controls, the flap settings. John absorbed it all with the same intensity he had brought to learning combat maneuvers 3 decades ago. But there was one conversation they couldn't avoid. "John, we need to talk about landing options. You've got about 3 hours of fuel left. The closest major airport is Shannon in Ireland. That's about 800 miles ahead. But here's the problem. Shannon has weather coming in, low visibility, strong crosswinds. It's going to be a challenging landing even for an experienced 777 captain. What are my other options? You could continue to London Heathrow. Better weather, longer runways, more emergency equipment. But that's almost 2 hours away, and you'd be landing with minimal fuel reserves." John did the math in his head. Shannon was closer but technically harder. Heathrow was farther but provided more margin for error. In combat, he'd learned that technical difficulty was preferable to no room for mistakes. "We go to Heathrow," John decided. "I'd rather have one difficult approach with fuel to spare than a perfect approach with no options if something goes wrong." "Good call. That's what I would have chosen too." Behind John, Jennifer had gathered the cabin crew to brief them on the situation. John could hear her voice trying to stay calm while explaining to the other flight attendants that their fate rested with a 67-year-old passenger who hadn't flown in 15 years. One of the flight attendants, a man named Marcus, approached John. "Sir, the passengers are asking questions. What should we tell them?" John thought about Sarah, Emma, and Lucas in seat 34. He thought about all the other families on this plane. They deserved honesty, but they also deserved hope. Tell them the truth. Tell them we have an experienced pilot at the controls and we're diverting to London. Tell them to listen carefully to all safety instructions. And tell them, John paused, choosing his words carefully, tell them we're going to get through this together. As word spread through the cabin about what was happening, reactions varied wildly. Some passengers became hysterical. Others fell into shocked silence. A few, the ones John respected most, simply asked what they could do to help. Sarah came forward to the cockpit, and when she saw John in the captain's seat, something in her face changed. This was the John she had met 35 years ago. Focused, determined, completely in his element. "The kids?" John asked without taking his eyes off the instruments. "Scared but okay. Emma thinks you're a superhero. Lucas is trying to be brave. I need you to go back and make sure they follow all the safety instructions when we start our approach. Can you do that for me?" Sarah leaned down and kissed the top of his head. 30 years I watched you go off to combat missions. I always knew you'd come back. Get us home, John." As they crossed into European airspace, Bob's instructions became more specific. "Okay, John, in about 20 minutes we're going to start our descent. This is where it gets real. I'm going to walk you through every step, but you need to understand, landing a 777 is nothing like landing a fighter jet. You're going to feel like the plane isn't responding, like everything is happening too slowly. That's normal. Trust the plane. Trust the instruments. Copy that. One more thing, John. In a fighter jet, you land fast and precise. In a 777, smooth is more important than precise. Don't fight the plane. Work with it." The descent began. Bob talked John through reducing altitude gradually, adjusting the autopilot settings, preparing the landing configuration. Every step was methodical, careful, leaving nothing to chance. But then, 50 miles from Heathrow, something went wrong. One of the doctors working on Captain Torres looked up with a grim expression. "He's gone. I'm sorry, but the captain didn't make it." John processed this information, compartmentalizing it the way he had learned to compartmentalize every tragedy he'd seen in 3 decades of military service. There would be time to mourn later. Right now, Captain Torres's last chance of his death meaning something was if John could save everyone else on this plane. "Bob, we just lost the captain. I need to make this landing count." "You will, John. Trust your training. Trust your instincts." At 30 miles from Heathrow, air traffic control cleared all other traffic from the airspace. Every emergency vehicle at the airport was positioned along the runway. Television news helicopters circled at a safe distance. Somehow, word had gotten out that an untrained passenger was attempting to land a Boeing 777. In the cabin, flight attendants prepared passengers for emergency landing procedures. The mood was a strange mixture of terror and determination. Everyone understood what was at stake. In row 34, Emma was crying softly while Lucas held her hand. Sarah sat between them, reciting a prayer she hadn't spoken since she was a child. At 20 miles out, Bob said, "Okay, John, this is it. In 5 minutes, you're going to disengage the autopilot and take manual control. Are you ready?" John's hands were steady on the controls. His heart rate was elevated but controlled. Every instinct from 3,000 hours of flight time was awakening. "I'm ready. All right. Airspeed 180 knots, altitude 3,000 feet. You're lined up perfectly with runway 27L. When I say disconnect the autopilot, the plane will feel heavy. That's normal. Small, smooth inputs on the yoke. You're not fighting an enemy, you're dancing with a partner." At 10 miles out, John's thumb moved to the autopilot disconnect button. This was the moment. Everything before this had been preparation. Everything after would be reaction. "Autopilot disconnected," John said. Immediately he felt the weight of the aircraft in his hands. The yoke was heavy, resistant, nothing like the responsive stick of an F-16. His first instinct was to overcorrect, but he remembered Bob's words, smooth, not precise. "How does she feel?" Bob asked. "Like flying a building," John muttered, but his hands were adjusting, learning, adapting with every second. At 5 miles out, the runway was visible through the windscreen. It looked impossibly small for an aircraft this size, though John knew it was actually 12,000 feet long, more than enough if he could control the descent rate. Airspeed 165 knots, altitude 1,500 feet. You're slightly high on the glide slope. Reduce throttle just a touch. John's hand moved to the throttle, pulling back with careful precision. The nose dipped slightly. Too much, throttle back up slightly. That's it, you're learning. 150 knots, altitude 1,000 feet. Looking good. In the cabin, passengers could see the ground approaching. Some were praying, some were crying, some were simply staring in numb shock. The flight attendants had taken their positions, prepared for either a successful landing or a crash. At 500 feet, John could see every detail of the runway. His training was taking over, his hands moving with muscle memory that predated conscious thought. 100 feet, throttle to idle, flare, easy, easy. The main landing gear touched the runway with a thump that was harder than ideal, but far from dangerous. The nose gear came down. John deployed the thrust reversers, a system he'd only learnt about 2 hours ago, and felt the massive aircraft decelerate. They were down. They were safe. The cabin erupted in cheers, crying, applause. In the cockpit, John's hands were shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Bob's voice came through the radio one last time. "Welcome to London, Captain Matthews. That was one hell of a landing." Emergency vehicles surrounded the plane as it came to a stop. Medical teams rushed aboard to treat First Officer Chen and to officially confirm what everyone already knew about Captain Torres. But before any of that, John stood up from the captain's seat, walked back through the cabin, and made his way to row 34. Emma and Lucas rushed into his arms, crying and laughing simultaneously. Sarah simply looked at her husband and said, "I knew you would." The aftermath was a blur of debriefings, medical checks, media interviews. John learned that Captain Torres had suffered from an undiagnosed heart condition that the stress of flying had finally triggered. First Officer Chen recovered after treatment for food poisoning. Both doctors who had tried to save the captain received commendations for their efforts. But for John Matthews, the real moment of clarity came 3 days later. When he was finally back home in Virginia, he was in his garden, but instead of tending his tomatoes, he was looking up at the sky as a plane passed overhead. Emma came outside and took his hand. "Grandpa, were you scared on the plane?" John thought about this question carefully. "A little bit, but you know what I learned, Emma. I learned that we're never really retired from who we truly are. I thought my flying days were over, but when people needed me, those skills were still there, waiting. "Will you fly again?" John smiled. "No, sweetheart. That was my last flight, but it was a good one." What John Matthews did that day became one of the most remarkable stories in aviation history. A retired fighter pilot who hadn't flown in 15 years, who had never trained on civilian aircraft, successfully landed a Boeing 777 with 237 people aboard, in adverse conditions, with no room for error. Experts later analyzed the flight data and concluded that John's landing, while rough, had actually been within acceptable parameters. His military training, his ability to stay calm under pressure, and his willingness to admit what he didn't know and listen to instruction had combined to create an almost impossible success. The airline offered John free flights for life. He declined politely, saying that he preferred to keep his feet on the ground from now on, but he did accept one honor. The airline named one of their new 777s the Spirit of Captain Matthews. Today, John still tends his garden and plays with his grandchildren, but sometimes, late at night, Sarah will find him in his office, looking at the certificate from the FAA commemorating his emergency landing, and she knows that he's thinking about Captain Torres, who didn't make it home that day, and about the 236 other souls who did. This story reminds us that heroes aren't always the ones wearing capes or uniforms. Sometimes they're retired grandparents, sitting in seat 34B, whose greatest adventure was supposed to be behind them. Sometimes they're ordinary people who, when called upon, discover they're capable of extraordinary things, and sometimes the skills we think we've left behind are simply waiting for the moment when we need them most, because as Captain John Matthews proved on that February night over the Atlantic Ocean, we never truly stop being who we were meant to be. We just wait for the moment when the world needs us to remember.